Happy Friday, everyone. Good afternoon on the Friday after Juneteenth. I'm glad you all are here. We're going to talk today about some of the stuff we spoke about in Juneteenth, about the way forward. Still thinking about sitting in the pain and strife of the current moment to really feel and have empathy, but also looking at how do we build toward justice. If it's not going to be given, we have to take it. And there are things that we all can do, no matter our ethnic background and historical context, like what you know or what you don't know about the current moment. So we're going to discuss some of those things today as we play. But as always, we want to take some time to breathe and center ourselves. So breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. As we're breathing in all the good things that the universe has for us in. And we breathe out all the crazy, all the anxiety, all of the carnage, all of the stress, everything out. It's interesting to start that way because of a concept called synchronicity. Even though we're all in different places checking out this broadcast, we're not in the same room together. When we breathe in together and we breathe out together, it creates, a connection. So that's how we can be connected to each other, even as we are socially distancing, even as we are in our own safe places, right? Because the pandemic is still going on. As always, also, after we're breathing and we're connecting to each other, we want to acknowledge our ancestors. So put those in the chat. We'll open up with the ancestral drum call, as is or has become our tradition, and then we'll get into it. All right, ancestors, we honor you. Verna and Frank Lomax, Ashe. Ed Bell, Ashe. Edna Bell, Ashe. Charles Bell, Ashe. William Bell, Ashe. George Bell, Ashe. Danielle Bell, Ashe. Who? Luke Small, Ashe. Mike Bell, Ashe. Patricia Bell, Ashe. Ashe, Ashe, oh. So last week, at the end of the Drumversations time, I tried to give, well, I didn't try. I gave what I thought was a vision of what Black America and by extension the diaspora would look like if we were truly free. If we were truly free, we would be practicing the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. And I use the 7 principles because that is a great framework for how we can engage each other and the power that we have together. Just as Black, we don't need nobody else to do that, right? We don't need anybody else. Those 7 principles are umoja, unity, right? In King's mountaintop speech, the last speech he gave before he died, he used unity as one of the 5 defining principles that Black America needed to be successful in the work of liberation, right? Unity is not agreeing all the time, right? Unity is understanding that we're trying to get to the same place. And every disagreement we have, because we all, even as Black Americans and Africans in the diaspora, have various and nuanced experiences, right? So we can't agree on everything. But we can agree on the ultimate outcome that we want to see for our people, which is liberation, ultimate liberation, the ability to define destiny for ourselves, to have those arguments toward that destiny, right? So unity is about the end goal, the outcome that we all want to see for each other, right? So umoja, unity. Then kujichagulia, which is self-determination, right? Freedom is not free. And so if we want to be truly free, then we have to commit to ourselves that we will do the work of being free. Again, King said in one of his speeches, we have to sign our own Emancipation Proclamation on our heart, right? Because we have to determine for ourselves that we will be free and we will not look to anyone else to give that to us. If we're going to take our liberation, then we have to also do the work of nation building. That's what a lot of people miss about Booker T. Washington. Washington is a complex figure because he was a great politician. But ultimately what Booker T. Washington built and what he stood for was self-determination, right? In the Atlanta Compromise, when he says, drop your buckets where you are, he's talking about stay here and build for yourselves, right? We built America, therefore we should build Black America, right? Self-determining, that means we are doing the work of being free, right? Ujamaa, cooperative economics. Along with the work of being free and along with the concept of being united, we are not just united in concept and in purpose, but our economic unity is what drives and finances that work, right? We talked last week about Black America having what would be the, I think I said 14th largest economy in the world, right? At, the 14th largest economy in the world at $1.3 trillion. Now think about it like this. The largest economy on the continent of Africa is Nigeria. It is growing at, even in the midst of COVID, it has grown because it's just one of those economies that are thriving. And at its height, peak gross domestic product is $380 billion. Second place on the continent is South Africa with $350 billion, right? And we understand how colonialism and colonial powers still have their hands on those domestic products. No different from Africans in America. But our GDP is $1.3 trillion. What happens if we become self-determining and we are united and we practice cooperative economics with $1.3 trillion, right? What can they do? They can't do anything about that. We can control all of that. The other thing we have to look at in terms of that in Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, is purpose, right? We unite, we agree to be self-determining, and unite on our end goals, ultimate liberation, freedom. We determine for ourselves what that looks like, and we work, Ujima, I skipped one, collective work and responsibility. We work and become responsible for those goals, right? And we finance those goals from our 1.3 trillion, and then we collectively work with the economies around the diaspora, Nigeria, South Africa, all the rest, and then we have even greater economic ability, right? So our 1.3 trillion can be the catalyst to a global economy in the diaspora itself, right? That's Ujamaa cooperative economics. And then we purpose those resources to our own ends. Again, if we're self-determining, we've united around our own goals, and we are working collectively and taking responsibility to finance that with our own resources, right? And that purpose should be the health, wellness, happiness, and anything else that we want for Black America and Africans in the diaspora in general, right? Our purpose should be our own efficacy, our ability to create and to do what it is we know is best for us, right? And that is inclusive of spiritual traditions, it's inclusive of institutions, hospitals, schools, and the like. It's every aspect of human beingness, right? And then we do that, how? We create. We are the most creative people on the planet. We created the pyramids, we created notions of deity, we created sciences, we created all of that stuff. So we create our reality, right? Because we are united and understand our purpose. And then we have to have faith in ourselves, each other, and our ancestors, and the universe, the gods of the universe that we understand have our back. Not white Jesus, not Christianity as it was taught to us in the slavery context, but any religious belief system or spiritual system that allows us and helps us have the agency to be self-determining and define the reality that is best for us is how we deal with that, right? So we have those 7 principles of Kwanzaa, and then we will be able to control our own food supply. We'll control our own hospital systems. We'll control our own means of production from, as it were, from the ground in terms of farming to the table. We control everything. If we're creating our own clothing products, we're also controlling the means of production for those clothes, not just the sewing, stitching, shipping, but where the raw materials are coming from, right? Everything. That means we're owning land. That means we're owning factories and other such means of production, transportation, logistics, all of those things, right? We have our own politicians. Even if we agree that we maintain, a connection with the mainstream of America, right? We have politicians that we funded that work on our behalf within that system, right? We own and control our own municipalities. We own and control our own policing and water systems, sewage systems, all of those things, right? We are liberated, self-determining people, right? So we do all of that for ourselves. We also, again, have international trade and commerce throughout the diaspora. We have to see ourselves as a global majority, not a statistical minority in the small context of one geopolitical state, which is the United States of America. But, a lot of people are like, well, that's easier said than done. Well, it's been done. We don't have to make this up. Right? That's what we did before colonialism. And even in the context of colonialism, we've done it. We have examples. Ruth and I were watching a documentary earlier this week about Haiti. And Haiti is a place where the enslaved people, Africans and indigenous folks, right, work together to throw off the bonds and the dominant control of France. Now, problematic, right? They were paying France reparations and all that other kind of stuff. So there are those things that we'll have to contend with. But the process of becoming free in Haiti was one in which there was unity around the outcome. They knew what they wanted, And they all agreed that their lives were the price and worth the price of that freedom. And then they adopted traditional belief systems from the motherland, Africa, right? We call it voodoo, voodoo, all that kind of stuff. Traditional belief systems that empower us from the inside out so we have agency to act in the world. Not belief systems that keep us, what's the best way to put it? That keep us docile, right? And then they acted. So they united, they developed a sense of self-concept that had freedom, liberation at its core, and then they did the work, including the dying, that needed to happen in order to be free, right? Many in America think that we don't have to take up arms. I don't know that we do have to take up arms. And I only say that not because I'm afraid to take up arms, but because I know that the American military is the most dominant military in the world, right? So that being said, I don't think that we can have a pathway to liberation that is not fraught with danger, right? And that danger can take many forms, as we have already seen, right? We have not raised up against the American military with arms, but they have still assassinated our leaders, right? So we cannot be afraid of those things. We have power that other folks just don't have. That is not just our blackness, it is our blackness and its connection to the universe, to the all, right? So we have spiritual power. We have the fortitude to be free. We just have to call upon those ancestors to give us the courage to continue to do that work, right? That's what, going back to those indigenous belief systems, indigenous to who we are culturally and otherwise, to put us in a framework, in a context, mentally and spiritually, that allows us to do that work without fear, right? If we adopt those ideals and those values, then freedom has already occurred because it happened consciously. It happened spiritually. Then we just have to do the work. There are other things that other folks need to do, and we'll talk about that later. So, all right. We talked about a little bit about what freedom looks like for black folk. But I want to assert a point that I think can't be asserted enough and hasn't really been asserted enough, which is that black people ain't the only black people, right? Again, if you trace the mitochondrial DNA genetic line back, everybody is African. Everybody descends from the continent. So that means white folk in America and Europe have also lost their cultural identity and their center, right? You can only do something like slavery. You can only commit those kinds of atrocities and everything that comes from that, right? And I'm not talking about, I'm talking about very specific history, right? There's a lot that's gone on in history that's bad, but I'm talking about very specific things. You can only commit the level of atrocity that happens in chattel slavery when you've forgotten who you are as a human being, when you've lost your sense of identity, right? That's the only reason why you hurt other people is because you have problems with yourself. And instead of checking your own issues and healing your own self, you inflict that level of pain on others, right? So there's stuff white people have to do, whether they're allies or not. All white people need to understand who they are fundamentally, right? You have a lot of white Americans saying, well, we need white spaces. We need, or we'd be racist if we had, white power days. Well, the reason why that's racist is because everything about power in America revolves around whiteness. That's why you don't see it, right? Every space in America is a white space unless it's claimed by somebody who's not white. That's why we have to have things like Black History Month or black music or any of those things, right? Because any other moniker that does not directly relate to the ethnic group who is doing the thing is automatically supposed to be white in terms of the consciousness of Eurocentric viewpoints that America is built on, right? And so what can white people do to see themselves as an ethnic group that is a part of many ethnic groups and ultimately descends from Africa? Well, first they have to unlearn. You got to unlearn. You got to realize that the way you were taught and the way I was taught in America was to keep this lie alive, right? That's why there are no less than 2 or 3 books, there might be more, that have in the subject the the miseducation of America or something like that, the dumbing down of America, that's what it is, right? I found at least 3 books that are titled The Dumbing Down of America, and each of them have different subtitles. It is that big a deal that Americans since the middle of the 20th century have not had the same level of education that even in public schools, that was happening before the height of the civil rights movement, because it does not serve the interests of the American power elite to have an educated populace. So white people have been miseducated just like everybody else, right? And if you think about the founding of the country, everybody wants to go, the founding fathers, we the people. Well, who were the people they were talking about? They weren't talking about poor white people, and they weren't talking about white women. That was the 1% of the day. And what the 1%, to use Occupy language, Occupy Wall Street language, what the 1% has always needed was for those of us who weren't in the economic elite to have something to divide us, right? And so notions of class and racist ideas, to use that context from Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be Anti-Racist, which are 2 books that are great places for white people to start. Those racist ideas have divided us. Right, just look up the John Punch case in Virginia, House of Burgess. I think it was 1690. I could be wrong on the date. But, it was the first case in American history. And America wasn't even a country yet. But it was the first instance in the legislative tradition history of what would become America, where indentured servants who were white were treated differently from indentured servants who were not white, who were black, right? This is where that whole idea of chattel comes from, because when these 3 people, one of whom was black, 2 were white, all experiencing the same uh, level of indentured servitude, right? Slavery, at that time temporary, but still slavery. They escaped because it was not good. Nobody wanted to be a slave. So all three of them escaped, right? So they all had the same level of experience, the same type of bad experience. White, quote unquote, slaves or indentured servants weren't treated better than black at that time. That was the thing that came next, right? They were all caught. The two white slaves, indentured servants, had their sentences extended, their servitude extended by 4 years or so. But the black one had his servitude extended for life. He became chattel, right? Because it served the economic purpose of the elite. That's what I'm getting at, right? So those who have been in the 1% have had a vested interest in keeping everyone else separated. If we don't understand each other and we're fighting each other at this lower level, quote unquote, in terms of economics and class, then we don't have time to see that they got their foot on both of our necks. And one of the ways that happens is through education. So the first thing white folk need to do who want to be allies, who want to deal with this work, is re-educate themselves. Unlearn what you've learned. Really, really, really investigate and think through why you believe what you believe. And again, there are resources on the website that's in the bottom corner, marklomaxii.com. There's a link at the bottom of our statement that points to some resources, podcasts like Drumversations, the one Ruth and I started, some books, and some other documentary type that really gets going on some of that re-education, right? That's the first place you start. Because feeling like you want to just jump in right now can be more harm than good for you and the people you think you're helping. You got to know what you're doing, right? And not that we all know exactly what we're doing, but some of us who have been doing this work have a historical context. We understand the why of the now, which informs how we move in the now, right? White people have privilege. There are conversations that you can have that I can't have, but I need you to be informed in those conversations so you can be useful and add value to this work, right? So the first thing is re-educate yourself and interrogate your beliefs. Why do you think the way you think? Why do you believe the way you believe? And why have you felt that's okay? And as you engage this new information, stamped from the beginning by Ibram Kendi, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, the book Racecraft by Karen Fields and Barbara Fields, Learning to Be White by Unitarian theologian Thandeka, Thandeka. Texts like that are really helpful. I mean, there's so many other, and I'm sure folks, my uncles and cousins and my dad, whomever is watching right now, can put books in the chat for folks to have a resource. That would be great. But you got to unlearn. You got to interrogate your belief system and why you think the way you think. And then you start to have conversations with folks who have been doing the work so you understand how best to engage, right? That's the process. In the meantime, immediately, you can shift your buying habits. You can support financially and otherwise with time and talent, movements for change, organizations that are working toward change. But in order for us to really have change substantively across this country, we have to shift beliefs and behaviors. And that starts with education. Yo, okay. So pointing again to those resources, we have a podcast, and the podcast can be found on iTunes and Spotify. And we're talking about a lot of these things more deeply, Ruth and I. Um, there's a book list, a list of resources again on my website, marklomaxii.com. And we'll be adding to that list periodically. So, I mean, there's an inexhaustive amount of resources for anybody, but especially for white folks, whether you are American or not, who want to engage in the work of social justice and be allies in the liberation of your people. I mean, here's the thing. It's not just that we're one human family. That's absolutely the truth. But not only are we one human family, we are all African. It's the truth. Science has proven it more often than not because of the mitochondrial genetic line. So white people have to remember who they are as much as Africans in the diaspora who have been disconnected from land and God and culture have to remember as well. And for Africans in America, Africans in the diaspora, one of those paths is to kind of reassert our traditional belief systems. And we can do that in American context by starting with the Nguzo Saba and then moving from there, right? Traditional belief systems that have, in South America and Haiti and other places, been overlaid with Western notions of Catholicism, right? The way we practice those Western religious practices like Christianity, Catholicism, or Protestant Christianity and Catholicism, all are Christian, has been creative in the sense that we have not lost our traditions. We have just kind of embedded them in this other tradition that was imposed on us and created a hybridized approach. That is the beauty of African creativity and genius, right? We figure out ways to be who we are, but oftentimes we bury ourselves so deep we can lose track of the actual core of the identity, and we have to rediscover that. And that leads to the last idea. So we've dealt with a path for Black America. We've dealt with a path for white America. And all other folks, can find their space in this last path because it becomes a spiritual thing, right? Do we believe in the power of humanity, our collected sense of self, right? I say it's a spiritual thing, not only just because I think that the ultimate idea of being, which many folks call God, whatever you want to call it, is a unifying force. I think that the all, the creator, the universe, whatever, put us in a position in a way that we're also connected to each other. And we have to honor those connections. Whether I know you or not, because you're human, we are connected, right? Whether I like you or not, whether I love you or not, we're still connected. I can't get away from that. And the idea there is from a very deep sense of spiritual center and values, right? I have to understand and love myself enough to know that if I harm you, I harm myself because we're that connected. Does that make sense? If you harm me, then you're harming yourself. That's why I said at the beginning that only people who have lost their sense of self can commit the level and sustained level of atrocities that have been committed upon Africans in the diaspora, or that created the diaspora, that European-derived folks have created. They've lost their sense of self. You're not French just because you're French. You're not British just because you're British, like in terms of geopolitical origins. No, you came from Africa. You are African. You just went through a process over time where your melanin adjusted to the climate that you found yourself in, and you experienced a level of deficit because of the Ice Age that put you in a constant state of war for resources. And when you're in a constant state of deficiency, of deficit, the way you see the world shifts, right? I work a nonprofit. We've seen in the last 10 years a lot of great research about deficit mentalities and how growing up impoverished, meaning not having enough, actually limits your brain's ability to function at the higher cognitive levels, right? So I would argue that because of the world climate history, When Africans left Central East Africa and moved out to explore the world, you know, and ended up in Europe before the Ice Age, they were still African. The Ice Age hits, you know, resources are not plentiful, abundant, and there are physiological changes, right? Melanin changes, the way our hair looks changes, even the way our nose is, everything changes to adapt our physical being to the climate we find ourselves in. But our cognitive ability also had to change, right? Because there weren't plentiful resources. And because of that, a war, a focus on war developed because there were skirmishes, fights, battles, wars for resources. And that just became a way of life, right? The whole reason for the slave trade was resources. I don't have enough wealth. I don't have enough this. There was no salt. There was no sugar, you know? And so all of these things had to be imported from around the world. And that imperialistic mindset says, I don't have, they have. I have weapons, they don't have weapons, so I'm going to take, right? That is not humane behavior. And we can't just say it's back there in the 14th and 15th centuries because America is still an imperial state. The West is still colonizing Africa and countries in the diaspora, right? There is not a place on the planet that the infestation of that deficit mentality that was born in Europe has not touched. In order for that to change, those who are European descendant have to heal. So there's work that Africans in the diaspora have to do. We have to heal from the constant pain and trauma that has been inflicted upon us by white America and Europe even. And there's work that white America and Europe has to do to reconcile itself with that history, right? Just because racism looks different in parts of Europe does not mean it doesn't exist. Xenophobia is a form of racism, right? So in France, they say, well, you can come to France, but you have to be French. Well, that's a form of racism. That's not honoring who I am as a North African, as an example, right? And the same goes for the rest of those countries that have policies like that. Even if they seem open to artists, I know for a fact that a lot of those places aren't treating their people of African descent well because of their nature and the history that comes from that deficit mentality, right? Just had a conversation before we started this Drumversation live stream about how we shift systems. And part of that conversation was around fear of having to give something up so others can gain. But my question is, what are you giving up? Because most of these things that you are afraid of giving up weren't yours in the first place, right? That's like me stealing your house and then I'm giving you the keys back. And I'm upset because I got to give you the keys. Well, the house wasn't mine in the first place, right? I took your house. So I think that if we can collectively begin the work of healing, as may be catalyzed from the recent spate of violence, police brutality, of violence in terms of the way the state has not worked to take care of its citizenry in the context of a global pandemic. These are all aspects of violence that take different shape, that manifest differently, but it's still violence. Some of it's psychological, some of it's physical, all of it is spiritual. We learn to recognize those things, and we learn to heal from those things, and we shift our collective behaviors. Black people in America acting in a way that gets us closer to our liberation, and white people act in a way that makes you more human and humane, understanding the history that you come from and that all of you have benefited from this racial construct. Whether you've participated in it willingly or not, you have benefited. So everybody has to reconcile that, right? Then we meet in the middle and we make the world a better place. Let's see, what time is it? We got? We got time to play one more piece. Thank you for hanging out with us. Are there any comments? Okay. Thank you for hanging out with us. We're gonna go out on a piece that I played for Juneteenth broadcast. It was Wade in the Water. Y'all have a great week. Don't forget, check out the website for more resources. Check out the podcast, like and share if you dig what's going on, and we'll see you next week. Peace. Peace.